It's a special pleasure for me to have a conversation with the Saudi Minister of Information and Culture, Adel Al Toraifi. Adel has served in this position now for several years. He's been a key member of the Deputy Crown Prince's Vision 2030 efforts and is a member of the Security and Political Affairs Council, which handles every major issue that's before the kingdom. He took a doctorate from the London School of Economics. He had the prescience to focus his dissertation on Saudi-Iran relations, which is certainly a topic that's been on his mind in recent years. I want to ask Minister Al Toraifi to begin by talking about a subject that's on the minds of every American, and I bet most Saudis too, and that's the election that's about to take place in the U.S. It's now less than 2 weeks away. Mr. Minister, I'm not going to ask you to make any predictions. I'm just going to cite the polls, which are now showing a solid and significant lead for Hillary Clinton to be elected and become the next president. So I want to ask you, in terms of the Saudi-American relationship, Secretary Clinton is someone known to the kingdom. What sort of changes do you think might be possible in the relationship? Is she somebody that you think the leadership in the kingdom could work with easily? Give us your sense of what a Saudi-American relationship would be like with that new administration.
Thank you very much. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here and to talk to this forum. And it's also a pleasure to be among Prince Turk Al Faisal and Prince Abdullah, who I both regard very highly, and to be also interviewed by David Ignatius, who used to write for Al-Sharq Al-Awsat. He used to be translated in Al-Sharq Al-Awsat newspaper, where I was the editor-in-chief. So
you were my editor. You were my boss.
I was the editor. Yes, indeed. Yeah, but we didn't dare to change anything of the articles. So it's a pleasure, actually, and an honor to be talking with you. As for the question that you mentioned, first of all, the American elections is an American matter. We have no opinion whatsoever about who's going to win and what the elections results would be. But I would say something that Saudi Arabia has always admired the American democracy, American values, American people, and the way they conduct politics here in the United States.
So, understood, and it wouldn't be appropriate to make a prediction, but if our polls are right, and if Secretary Clinton is elected, is she somebody that you think the kingdom's leadership could work with?
Well, see, the kingdom is one of the allies of the United States. It's for us, the United States is the ally number one, and it will continue. Therefore, whoever who comes to the presidency will be very important to us to speak with and work with. And this is a policy that has been there for decades, and it will continue to be so. There are a lot of interests between Saudi Arabia and America, and we think that those interests will continue to be so, regardless of who wins the race. And we hope for everyone who has ran a good fair yeah.
So let me ask about an issue that is deeper than this election. It was a question that was put to Prince Abdullah, and it's one that I've been looking forward to hearing your thoughts about. The passage of the JASTA legislation by such a substantial margin was, to many observers, a sign of problem deeper down in this relationship, which, as you say, is close and has been going on for many decades. But there's something that's happening. A prominent Saudi analyst was quoted in the New York Times after the passage of this legislation, saying JASTA is a wake-up call for the Saudis, that it's time to revisit the concept of the alliance with the U.S. And I want to ask you whether you have any of that same feeling, that JASTA shows that there is less political support than you might have thought in Congress, and what to do about that.
Well, 3 points to answer this question. First of all, that JASTA is a Congress bill, so it's an American issue, first place. Second, I disagree with this comment. Saudi Arabia will more strengthen its relationship with the United States in the future. This is a strategic relationship that has been built over decades. And third, that JASTA is a concern, as Prince Abdullah has mentioned earlier, for many countries, not only for Saudi Arabia. Why? Because it touches on the immunity of nations, the sovereignty of nations, and we think that this is a concern and also a problematic matter, not only for the countries in the Middle East or countries around the world, but also to the American people. Dozen of American security experts that I've spoken with have shown their concern. And you can imagine if courts are opened all over the world to surpass sovereign immunity and bring to court states, that will definitely have an impact on the international community.
That point was made, I should just underline the obvious, strongly by President Obama, who felt that this legislation was a terrible mistake, vetoed it, and was unable to sustain his veto. I just want to ask you, I was on the verge of calling you before the vote to try to interview you on this, but now I have to ask you after. What would you say as Saudi Arabia's Minister of Information to the Americans who feel, and it was obvious that this feeling helped drive the vote, who feel that Saudi Arabia could do more to fight the extremism that's been a danger to the kingdom and to the whole Muslim world now for decades? How would you answer that?
Well, two things, I think. First of all, that Saudi Arabia has been at the front line of fighting terrorism before September 11th. Saudi Arabia, since 2003, have been fighting terrorism in its own country. It succeeded in 2006 in kicking Al-Qaeda out. Then we had the 2011 uprisings. Then we had a second wave of terrorism across the Middle East that even have occurred in several European countries and here in America. So it's a problem that does not concern Saudi Arabia alone. It concerns the world. As a matter of religious educating or schooling, we have seen terrorists who committed terrorist acts here in the United States and abroad in Europe, and horrific acts actually. And they have not been educated anywhere in the Middle East. So the notion of being educated in a certain country or schooled in a certain country that will produce you as a terrorist does not apply that much to Saudi Arabia. Another angle, I would say, that we have conducted our research here in the United States with a number of experts and American enterprises, and we have came to a conclusion that how the American people look to Saudi Arabia is not far away from how they look to other countries. So the notion of that Saudi Arabia is behind or was behind, you know, is a thing that was intended by Osama bin Laden in the first place. You know, he wanted. If you ask yourself, what was the reason behind September 11th? The reason was Osama bin Laden who was his citizenship was revoked by the Saudi government and was listed as a terrorist at the moment, at that time in Saudi Arabia. His target was actually to destroy the Saudi-U.S. relations.
Right.
And luckily, that didn't happen. We went through very difficult time, but that only have strengthened our relationship. As someone who is working actually with a lot of American colleagues and meeting with American officials with the Saudi leadership, I can see that on a daily basis.
So we have a new opportunity ahead for the U.S. and Saudi Arabia to work together to find ways to be good partners and allies in what hopefully over the coming months will be the end of the Islamic State's control of key cities in Iraq and Syria. And I want to ask you about your own thinking and that of your colleagues in the security cabinet in Saudi Arabia about what role Saudi Arabia might play. First, let's take Iraq. Is the Abadi government in Iraq one that you now feel comfortable enough with that you might join with that government in trying to help Sunnis in Iraq feel that they have more of a stake in the future?
Well, see, if we want to talk about the problems of the region, first and foremost, we need to talk about Iran. And we need to talk about Iran as a regime and as a revolutionary guard, not Iran as a people or a nation.
Well, let's come to Iran. The best way you could argue to stop Iran is to have a stronger Iraq, where the Sunni parts of Iraq feel a confidence and strength again. And that's what I'm asking. Is there a way for Saudi Arabia, even given its suspicions about Iranian involvement in Iraq, to help the Abadi government in what's ahead?
Well, see, when Abadi became prime minister, Saudi Arabia welcomed that, as you know, and sent even an ambassador to Iraq to support Iraq, and have supported Iraq even financially through international organizations. And Saudi Arabia does not look to Iraq as sects or minorities. You know, it looks to Iraq as a modern state that should remain a modern state, inclusive of all, regardless of race, religion, or ethnicity. Nevertheless, this is not the same way how Iran looks at Iraq. Iran had a war with Iraq for about 8 years. The destruction of Iraq is a pillar and the goal of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's strategy. So they want a destroyed Iraq. They want a divided Iraq. Now the countries in the region can do much little after America left Iraq. I mean, the international community alone, with the help of America and the regional powers, can exert some power to help any government in Iraq to restore peace and to get rid of those terrorist organizations that are operating there and in Syria as well. But still, you have a dysfunctional situation down there, and you have sects and ethnicities who are fighting each other.
So let's turn to the other part of this tragedy, and that's Syria. I'm sure people in the kingdom, as I believe people here in the United States, feel a deep sense of shock as they see pictures of the destruction of a beautiful city, Aleppo, and the human suffering there. Secretary Kerry has worked with his Russian counterpart almost nonstop since last February to try to get a cessation of hostilities, so far without success. And that effort has now led to talks in Lausanne, multilateral talks of which Saudi Arabia is a part. And my question would be whether you feel that these discussions, which include Iran, include Russia, include all the key players in this Syrian tragedy, whether you think there's any possibility of preventing a catastrophic fall of Aleppo through those negotiations. What's your sense?
Well, my sense is that Syria has been a tragedy over the last couple of years. A beautiful country that have fallen into civil war and destruction, and have been and became under the pressure of a tyrant, Assad, and terrorist groups on the other side, while the moderates suffered in the middle. Now, I have to say that I have seen Secretary Kerry and the Obama administration actually working very effective in the past months to work a peace agreement down there. And I have to commend Secretary Kerry on his effortless work, I have to say. Nevertheless, you don't see that happening. And the reason behind that, in my opinion, belongs to the regime in Tehran. They don't want to have a ceasefire. They don't want to have a no-fly zone. They don't want to. They want continuation of the situation until Assad wins. At least this is what they're thinking. Or at least they want a divided Syria, Syria that cannot stand anymore as a state. So if a peace agreement can be reached, I think the international community should support it. But nevertheless, on the ground, you don't see that happening.
But I hear you saying that Saudi Arabia, for now, will continue to stick with Secretary Kerry's effort in Lausanne.
Yes, indeed. Saudi Arabia, as the Saudi government has expressed in several communications of the Saudi cabinet, that it supported the United States efforts in trying to bring peace to the Syrian people, working with the international community and the UN. And we have not gone far from there. And we wish for that to happen, but it's not.
One more question about the region, and then I want to ask you about the things within the kingdom. When we look at the region, one big change in the last 2 years is the much greater role of Russia, militarily, but also diplomatically. Key Saudi officials visit Russia now regularly, and vice versa. One foundation stone of Saudi policy for as long as I can remember was Saudi's suspicion of Russia and Russian aims in the Middle East. You now seem more willing to work with the Russians, unless I'm mistaken. So maybe you could just explain how your government looks at Russia and its role, whether you're comfortable with them as a power player. Give us the Saudi view of the new Russian play in the Middle East.
Well, see, Russia is a very strong country, and it had its presence in the Middle East decades before, and especially in a country like Syria. The Saudi position is actually to respect great and good relations with Russia, and we are working together in the fields where opportunities and interests can work. We know that there are disagreements, but you can limit them to a number of issues. Nevertheless, we always consider the United States our number one ally in the region and internationally. So we're not in the game between the great powers, but we respect countries and we would like to have great relations with them, and we want to benefit both sides, both nations, from economic opportunities, development opportunities, and we're not a state that is occupied by notions of war or expansion or delivering or exporting revolutions like Iran, for example. No, we're a country which chooses a vision 2030, who our king has led, and who our deputy crown prince has been the mastermind behind it.
So let's turn to things inside the kingdom. Vision 2030 and your implementation plan. As you know, because I brought a marked up copy with me one day, I've read each of the key performance indicators and each of the, I counted 178 strategic initiatives that were in your implementation plan. So I want to ask you, frankly, as somebody who knows you pretty well, as somebody who used to work for you, how's it going? We saw that document. It's very ambitious. It talks about a different Saudi Arabia. But when I read it, I remember thinking, this is really a heavy lift. That Adel, that the Deputy Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, that King Salman have undertaken. How's it going?
Well, it's going, in my opinion, very naturally. We knew that, in your words, it's a heavy lift. But we wanted Saudi Arabia to change. This is the vision of King Salman himself. He wanted a better Saudi Arabia for the Saudis. And this has translated to the Crown Prince and the Deputy Crown Prince working both sides to deliver that. Now, Vision 2030 and the National Transformation Plan speaks about the societal, economic, and development side. While you have in the economic, in the Security and Political Affairs Council, you have another side which is trying to protect Saudi Arabia from threats abroad and trying to strengthen the security within Saudi Arabia. The culture that have emerged, I would say, with the Economic and Development Council headed by Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the Deputy Crown Prince, is a new culture to Saudi Arabia. When you go to a ministry in Saudi Arabia 3 years ago or 4 years ago, try to speak about KPIs and strategic goals and producing a 5-year plan and having initiatives that needed to be delivered in a specific time. You would find that a very foreign language. Nevertheless, we as ministers bear the pressure as well, and our colleagues in the ministries bear the pressure to transform our culture and how we work, how we develop, how we operate our ministries in Saudi Arabia.
Well, I remember you describing to me some sleepless nights as you tried to finish the work that you had to do. One key part of the Vision 2030 and these reforms is the idea of privatization of Saudi Aramco and some other key companies. I see many prominent business people in the audience. So I want to ask you what I think is one of the hardest and most important questions. If you privatized even a small portion of Saudi Aramco so that it was publicly owned, traded in international markets, international standards of transparency and efficiency would apply. that's a very different situation from one in which Saudi Aramco can act as a kind of social welfare body, taking care of people in the kingdom, in which sometimes the standards of transparency have not been the same that you'd find in London or New York. So I've heard some people ask quietly, I wonder if it's really time yet for that kind of privatization and that level of change. What do you think? Are you still committed to that?
Well, you're asking me to violate a promise I gave to the Energy Ministry, Engineer Khalid Al-Faleh. I've told him that nobody should speak about energy or oil or Aramco other than him. And I gave the same advice to my fellow ministers. So if I'm going to comment on Aramco itself, I'm committing the same mistake they've said. But nevertheless, you spoke about something very important, which I can comment on, which is transparency. That's very important. The privatization of Aramco needs that kind of transparency that you've mentioned. And in fact, last year when we were working on the budget announcement, the head of the Economic and Development Council, Prince Mohammed bin Salman's concern was how to change the language and the discourse on the Saudi budget to make it more transparent. And we spent weeks to try to develop a more linear disclosure of the budget and to make the budget more transparent. So if we have done that with the budget itself, we think we can do it with Aramco, we think we can do it with a lot of transparency has become a very important part of our work. And you spoke about the key indicators. Well, a number of them are actually about transparency. How can you deliver an initiative through a ministry and make it transparent, that you know where the money went, you know how the project was done, and you know that the project was done accordingly to the promises that was given.
So that's a useful answer, and I think reaffirming that goal of transparency is central to the Deputy Crown Prince. That's going to be one of my takeaways from our conversation. Another question that I think the whole world wonders about is the Deputy Crown Prince and King Salman's, Crown Prince's vision of the future role and conduct of Islam in the country that is, as the ruler's title proclaims, the custodian of the two holy mosques. Reading the Vision 2030 statement, I read language that talks about a changing role, a changing definition. But I want to ask you, we've read stories of new discipline on the mutawin, the religious police. We've read about changes in the status and role of women, their ability to vote, perhaps someday their ability to drive. Give us your best current statement of what reforms you think are desirable, are part of Mohammed bin Salman's vision for the future of the kingdom.
Well, first of all, we need to always remember what Saudi Arabia means to the Muslim world. As you mentioned, it houses the two holy places of Islam, Mecca and Medina. It's where Arabic language and culture has emerged. And it's a central player, the most central player in the, not only in the Middle East region, but also in the Islamic world and in the international world. Saudi Arabia is a member of the G20, and so it's an economic and energy power as well. So, and it's also security power for the world. Saudi Arabia have been fighting terrorism very ferociously in the past.
Well, I know you're on the front lines of that fight every day, but I do want to ask about what the vision is of change and modernization, if you will,
yes,
in the sphere of religion.
Well, see, one of the things is that in the past, you didn't have that much pressure to change or to modernize some sectors. And sometimes there were sectors that you didn't have. I'll give you an example. One of the decrees that King Salman, the custodian of the two holy mosques, have made a few months ago was the creation of the Entertainment Commission. We didn't have an Entertainment Commission. We didn't have an entertainment sector in the sense that you would recognize it in a state as large as Saudi Arabia. So the vision actually, I want to talk about two things. One, about the vision being a tool to actually transform Saudi Arabia to the better. We want to be a better nation. So this is why you have within the Vision 2030 a big role for women in the workplace future-wise that we would like to increase. King Abdullah, may his soul rest in peace, has made a scholarship program that have lasted now for more than a decade and is supported now by King Salman himself, which has brought a lot of young minds, women and men back to Saudi Arabia to be part of that Vision 2030 to change. And the vision in every part of it, whether if it's economics, culture, education, or entertainment, is seeking actually to transform Saudi Arabia to make it a better place for Saudis to live, to the Saudis to be proud of. Our goal, for example, in the Culture Ministry is to strengthen the Saudi sense of identity, of Saudi identity. And that comes when you make your country a better place for its people. When the younger generation, for example.
So is there a time when I'll visit you in Riyadh and we'll go to the movies or go to a museum or go to a play? How far away is the day when we'll do that?
Well, on the second day of Ramadan, I remember we were delivering the National Transformation Plan. And it was our turn in the Culture Ministry to speak about our initiatives. And we had 9 initiatives, and some of our initiatives include actually the establishment of the Royal Art Complex of Arts, which will include an orchestra, a Saudi orchestra, which would include a national theater, a national gallery, and much of the things that you've mentioned. And if you want to go to a play now in Saudi Arabia, they're actually doing some plays in a number of stages that we and the education and other actually, and the commission and the entertainment commission have done, have reopened the stages, have renovated a lot of things. And in the words of a wise man who once told me, Saudi Arabia is going back to a period prior to 79. We used to have all of those things. And those are things, they're not strange to us. But we want now to embrace them, to have a better life, and for another thing which you have asked, is the Islamic discourse. We are so keen on moderating the Islamic discourse, not only for Saudi Arabia, for the Muslim community internationally. I remember that I once asked Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who's the defense minister as well, when he wanted to announce the Islamic coalition to fight extremism, Daesh, and other terrorist groups. And I had a discussion with him about why are we doing this? Why only Muslim states? And his answer was, I think, very important to me. He said if the Muslim communities and Muslim states do not become at the forefront of the war on terror, they will be the victims, and they will be the final targets, and they will fall. This is why we need to build an Islamic coalition that is supported internationally by the international community, and we need not to only think about fighting it militarily alone, but we need to add to it another component, an intellectual component, which is moderating the discourse on Islam itself. And this is actually part of the Islamic Coalition's job. It's actually part of the ministry that I'm responsible to run. It's also the responsibility of the Islamic Affairs Ministry. We have plenty to do in moderating and actually providing the world with a better discourse about Islam. And we need to actually fight and erase the awful things that have been done in the name of Islam by those terrorist groups in the past decade.
So that's a powerful takeaway for me, that you're publicly stating and making a commitment to moderate the discourse on Islam, and we'll obviously follow that with great interest. Mr. Chairman, if I might ask one final question,
yes,
and
indeed,
then we'll.
Please.
So I do want to ask you about we talked about the terrible wars in Iraq and Syria, but you have a tragic war on your southern border in Yemen, and we follow it with concern. The tragic killing of the 100 or so people who were attending the funeral in Sana'a recently is an example of the awful things that happen in wars. So I want to ask you, perhaps you would focus on the question of the peace negotiations that have been underway for many months. Early this month, there was again hope that peace process might move forward. The Houthis, with their Iranian supporters, were making demands for written formula for transition, but there was at least again discussion of stabilization. And so let me ask you, based on your conversations with the defense minister, with others, where do things stand in the negotiations, and generally, how are you going to put that broken country back together, assuming that you can get some kind of a peace agreement?
Well, if it was for us and we could do it, I think Saudi Arabia would have done it. We want peaceful Yemen. We want a prosperous Yemen for the Yemeni people. King Salman has always expressed that what's happening in Yemen is a tragedy, not for Yemen alone. It's a tragedy for the whole region. The Deputy Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Naif, has always read into the Yemen struggle that it's going to be a big source of instability for the region. And people think about it as a war between Saudi Arabia or the coalition and the Houthis and Ali Abdullah Saleh. But in fact, it's a war between Yemenis themselves. It's a civil war. What is problematic to us is that the continuous attacks from the Houthis and Ali Saleh on Saudi borders, targeting Saudi civilians and using ballistic missiles that on the last Eid of Adha have killed a child and an adult. And they are continuously hitting and targeting Saudi villages and Saudi towns, and they have not stopped their operations. Now, when it comes to talking about the negotiations and supporting the negotiations, Saudi Arabia have expressed on several occasions in its cabinet, weekly cabinet statements that it supported the international community work on Yemen. It supported the international envoy on Yemen. We have lended support to the international community and to the international envoy on Yemen. And we do seek and hope that the Yemenis would do a peace agreement together. And we are willing, as others are willing, to see that, reaching a fruitful stage. And we're working not alone. We're working with international partners and regional partners to achieve that goal. Unfortunately, whenever what do you call it, an agreement is written or almost to be concluded, orders comes from the Revolutionary Guard in Iran. And I need to say something, because I mentioned Iran several times. I need to say something about the Iranian people and to distinguish between the two. The custodians to the holy mosques, King Salman, always spoke about Iran before the revolution and how great nation and people it is. And he always expressed how he looks so sadly to Iran under the rule of this current regime, who seeks no stability, who declares in its constitution the export of 12-verse Shiism, so they insist on even being sectarian on that sense. And we feel also for the Iranian people and the suffering they had on the hands of this regime. And we see them, but we understand that Iran is not going to change its ways now. We haven't seen any indications that this will happen. And therefore, we anticipate that they will not seek peace in other parts of the world. And this is their notion.
So Mr. Chairman, I should bring it to an end here. Let me just say, in concluding, just a personal word. To me, the opportunity to ask the Saudi Minister of Information direct questions, to have a conversation, to write things occasionally that may not be entirely what one might want, but to continue that process, that's the kind of Saudi-American dialogue that I understand. It's in my business of journalism and your business of education. I should also say that Minister Al Toraifi, I hope it's all right to say.
No, Adel, we know each other.
Well,
that
we do. Since I always like to address people by their titles, but I should say that Adel just got married. And a man who is congratulations. But a man who is willing to bring his new bride to Washington to a big convention on his way to a wonderful honeymoon, I'm not going to say where, is a man who is really making a commitment to all of us. So my friend, my former editor, thank you for doing this.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. And if I have to say something, that the candid conversation between Saudis and Americans is very important. And we expressing our views, our American friends expressing their views is paramount for us. We will learn from you, and hopefully we might have something to provide as well. About your writings or others, just see what other writers in Saudi Arabia are writing about their own minister of culture or other ministries. So we're very comfortable with this. It helps us correct our way. It helps us also to improve our job, and this is the healthy way. And this is, I think, something we can take from this conversation.
On that, I hope we all agree. Thank you very much.